everybody, and welcome back to Psychedelics Today. This is Joe Moore coming at you from Breckenridge, Colorado. Today on the show, we have Kyle Buller. Kyle is busy, and he's out in Amsterdam now for the ICPR conference. We also had a little Vital retreat before that. I think it was Vital Breath Work, and that was pretty great. And so today on the show, we have two new people. I don't believe they've been on the show before. Dr. Alex Belser and Dr. Bill Brennan, discussing a new methodology for psychedelic therapy they've put together. It's been around for a bit. They call it EMBARK Psychedelic Therapy. Book is EMBARK Psychedelic Therapy for Depression, a new approach for the whole person. Came out in April. So Dr. Belser did a bunch of research at NYU and Yale, and Dr. Brennan brings a bunch of experience as a clinical supervisor and trainer, and talk all about this EMBARK model. Yeah, so I think you're going to like this one. It's nice to have a different model. Everybody kind of knows this MAPS model to a degree, and it's nice to have another model that we can speak to, because it does have a lot of clinical data backing it. So I think you'll dig that. So actually, I was super wrong. Alex has been on the show a few times, including episode 413, where he was talking about being a co-editor of the Chacruna book, Queering Psychedelics from Oppression to Liberation in Psychedelic Medicine. And yeah, I think that's it for the intro. Check out our retreats. We've got one coming up in Pennsylvania quite soon. Go to psychedelicstoday.com to learn more about that one. That's breath work. And we have Vital coming up. Vital applications are open, and classes start in mid-September. So that's at vitalpsychedelictraining.com. And you can always find all our stuff at psychedelicstoday.com. All right, enjoy this episode, and we will see you on the other side.
All right. Dr. Alex Belser, Dr. Bill Brennan, welcome to Psychedelics Today. I'm really excited to be sitting down with both of you in person. Welcome to the show. Alex, you've been on the show before, but we'll start with you. A little bit of an introduction. Can you give the listeners a little bit of background, who you are?
It's really sweet to be sitting across my kitchen table from you in real life. So many remote Zoom sessions have sort of left us disconnected. It's nice to be here. I'm a clinical scientist. I'm a psychologist. My specialization has been in psychedelic therapies, and I love psychedelic therapy. It's become like a bit of a calling, something that's I've shaped my life around. I was a researcher at NYU for over a decade. I finished my postdoctoral work at Yale and have done psilocybin trials mainly at NYU and Yale. I was formerly the chief clinical officer at Cybin and a founder at Nautilus Sanctuary, which is a nonprofit that did MDMA research with MAPS. And I'm here with Bill Brennan, my co-author on the EMBARK Psychedelic Therapy book, and a psychologist as well.
Yeah, so I'll pass it over to you, Bill.
Sure, yeah, I agree. It's really nice to be sitting here and talking. It's been nice hanging out. A little about me. I'm a psychologist also in New York City. Been working in psychedelic research for a couple of years. I've been interested in psychedelics for 20 plus years. Working with Alex Belser at Cybin on the EMBARK model. Working as a clinical supervisor and trainer and educator on several psychedelic trials, both at Cybin and at Gilgamesh. And really excited about all the potentiality in the space.
Sweet. Thank you. So congratulations to you both and whoever else was part of being an author and editor of this new book on EMBARK. So excited. It's coming out next week, you said, right? So you guys just are about to publish a book.
Yeah, the book is coming out on the 23rd of April. It's called EMBARK Psychedelic Therapy for Depression, a new approach for the whole person. And I think it's a pretty exciting book. I'm a little biased, but it is... It contains a lot of great information about the EMBARK model, and it's also a pretty comprehensive guide on how to work within the EMBARK model, how to do psychedelic treatment for depression with EMBARK.
We really aimed it as like a thorough how-to guide, for like hands-on clinical, like what you do in the room, in preparation, in a medicine session, in integration, like what it looks like, what are the different clinical scenarios that can arise when doing psychedelic work with people.
Yeah. And to give you a little background on it, it grew out of the EMBARK work we did at Cybin. So the book itself is actually the outgrowth of some of the treatment manuals we were writing for the clinical trials, including one that was showing some successful top-line data recently. And it was a really iterative process of writing it, meaning like we kept giving the facilitators more and more information and hearing what was lacking from the original manuals that we wrote and building more in that they needed. So it was a very... we think that the final book is something that's really responsive to what facilitators need in this work.
Amazing. And you guys also have an open access course online too that goes over the model.
Yeah, our intention with the model was for it to be open sourced, open access. So we call it EMBARK OA. It's at embarkapproach.com. And there's free foundational training materials there. It's not a comprehensive training, but I think there's about 15 hours of video from all of our different faculty members, people who've been doing this work in different studies in the space for a long time. And you can register for free. We've had over 4,000 people register already. Yeah.
That's amazing. So I know EMBARK is also an acronym. Could you talk about what EMBARK is and how you guys are kind of conceptualizing this type of work?
Yeah, absolutely. Bill, would you walk us through the acronym? And I'll just say, like, we started this project by canvassing all the existing psychotherapies in the space. We looked at everything that had been published. We'd been, therapists or researchers on a lot of these trials. And a lot of the early psychedelic therapy space was like, let's take an existing evidence-based therapy and just kind of drop it down into here. Like let's do CBT, or let's do psychedelic therapy in like a set and setting model. But what does that mean? It wasn't necessarily like written out or even formally conceptually developed in a mature way. And then with the sort of issue of ethics, right, and ethical violations and breaches in the space, we really wanted to center ethics into the space. We wanted to center culturally competent care, and we wanted to understand healing through multiple different clinical domains, right? Not everybody who walks into a psychedelic clinical room space is going to have the same experience, right? A variety of experiences and a variety of different healing trajectories. We wanted a therapy model that addressed the heterogeneity of people's experiences.
Yeah, I think that really is the heart of EMBARK, and it's really the heart of the acronym that makes up its name, the EMBARK clinical domains. In that, implicit, like baked into it, is this recognition that people are going to have really different experiences, that healing with psychedelics can take place in a variety of ways, and that clinicians going into this work should really be prepared to support healing processes that go on in any of these 6 domains. And the first domain, the E, is the existential spiritual domain. And what that really represents in EMBARK is just a space for recognizing that some people have experiences that they define as spiritual or mystical, or sometimes people are just grappling with content that's better defined as existential, just like big picture questions. And a lot of what they take away from the experience is around that. The M domain is the mindfulness domain. And this one mostly refers to any kind of shift in the person's relationship to their sense of self or relationship to the workings of their own mind, something that gives them a little bit more of that psychological flexibility or mental freedom, an ability to take a step back and relate differently to like habitual things that the mind does. The B domain is the body-aware domain. So really bringing the body in, because we've seen in a lot of qualitative studies of psychedelic participants that their experiences are deeply embodied. They have these experiences that unfold in a range of ways that involve various aspects of embodiment. Something purgative, perhaps, or maybe something that's like visualizing whatever they're struggling with in their body and relating to it in their body. And then there's a lot of somatic phenomenon that people feel is healing, like trembling, shaking, what's often called like a discharging of energy, although clinicians can bring their own set of terms to it. And just recognizing that the body is not just a site for symptoms or a site for information about what's going on in the mind, but maybe there are healing processes that are happening there too. The A domain, affective cognitive, that one's pretty bread and butter for psychotherapists. It's just a lot of core beliefs, the emotions associated with them, transforming those core beliefs. A lot of CBT type approaches plug in well there. The R domain is the relational domain, realizing that healing also happens in relationship with the therapist, with other people in the participant's life, and that's something to really work in. It's not we found that a lot of psychedelic therapies have a kind of diminished sense of what the therapist-participant relationship can be and all the different dynamics there that contribute to healing. So we wanted to build that out a lot too.
Yeah, and I just wanted to jump in the R domain for EMBARK. I mean, a lot of therapies objectify the client, the person, and to subjectify them is to see them within the relational, like as self-constituted in human relationships, right? So when I was interviewing people who had taken psilocybin in our trials at NYU, in these in-depth interviews, I wasn't even asking about family, but people would talk about their husband, their wife, like these deep relational events that would be part of their psychedelic journey and their relationship with the therapy team that was with them in the room. And so, it's not like psychedelic therapy is some sort of conveyor belt that we deliver a service to like an inert object. Like that person is an agent acting relationally with other people in the room and in their own history and mind in a very deep way, actually. And that can be quite hard and healing.
Yeah, definitely. And the final domain of the 6, the final domain is the K domain, which stands for keeping momentum. And in general, this is just a space in EMBARK for people who have these experiences of great motivation for making change or doing something different with their behavior or making changes to the context in which they live, recognizing that as an important part of treatment too, like really carrying that through from the dosing session to integration sessions.
Amazing. Thinking about all these domains, are you guys really kind of pulling from different theories? So I'm going to use the B since I'm kind of somatically oriented. Are you weaving in any sort of somatic theories, like anything from Peter Levine or Bessel's work? Or are you kind of keeping it open? I heard, Bill, you were saying, the therapist or clinician could bring some of their own language. So how are you guys thinking about that? And are you incorporating any of those theories in there?
Yeah, we definitely wanted EMBARK to be a kind of big tent model that people can bring their own existing skills and orientation to. We didn't want to, we were definitely inspired by a whole range of different psychotherapies, but we didn't want it to be wedded to just one. So we have these 6 domains that really just reflect types of experiences people have. But in order to serve change in those domains, therapists can bring whatever skills they have that fit within those domains. So if someone has a somatic background in somatic experiencing, they can bring that into the B domain. If they've done training in something like acceptance and commitment therapy, that would fit well in the M domain. The main thrust of EMBARK is just that any individual participant who goes into a dosing session could have an experience that touches on any of these 6 domains. So clinicians should be ready to support change in those 6 domains.
Yeah, so exactly. So like in the body aware, the EMB, the B domain of EMBARK, we have associated evidence-based treatments, right? So we don't have like a full-fledged somatic evidence-based treatment, but specific techniques from SC, from somatic experiencing, Peter Levine's work and other people's work can be brought in there. Right. This is a time-limited therapy, right? You're working for a few sessions of prep, usually a few sessions of integration. And it can build upon the clinician's skills, right? The idea that you'd give somebody even a 200-hour training, a comprehensive training, and that they would be like fully fledged to do all the different things. It's sort of silly, but we know that some people have a lot of previous experience, like yourself, with somatic approaches. And Manuel and Mishkarid's taught for our initial cohorts on somatic and body-aware practices. And our intent was not to provide a comprehensive training in somatic practices, but to provide some basic competency introductory work so that when people have profound somatic experiences, if that becomes a central organizing thread for that person, that their clinical facilitators, that they know how to approach it in a supportive way rather than a harmful way.
Yeah, amazing. I'm trying to think Leo Zeff probably had some protocols back in the day with his book. And then we have the MAPS manual for MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. You worked at Hopkins or NYU, and you probably had a manual for the psilocybin. What were, I guess, like some of the challenges? Psychedelic therapies are kind of unique in a way than maybe just regular like CBT treatment, right? So what were some challenges like putting a framework together, or were there any, or was it like just kind of pulling from all your years of experience?
Have you ever written a manual for how to be a human person in the world?
But I imagine it's very challenging.
I mean, Bill is really a real systems thinker and a real architect, and we wanted to build an open architecture. So our intention was to build from the best teaching that we had received in our training. I think that one of the reasons when we canvassed the existing field is that we saw all of these clinical trials happening and there really weren't manuals, or there were very few. And actually, we published on sort of reporting in psychedelic clinical research. We found that the majority of clinical trials don't report on their clinical manual. It's hard to replicate a trial when you don't know what they're doing, and the vast majority don't report on things like therapy adherence. Like, is the actual therapist in the room actually doing what the approach says they're doing? Are they doing something else, some homebrew thing or their own approach? And the short answer is most of these trials, even if they did it, track that on video and sort of making sure people were maintaining fidelity, they don't report on it. So we wanted to really attend to that in some way while not handcuffing the therapist. We wanted to give them some agency in the work with the person they're working with.
Yeah, I think that's all really speaks to the heart of what was challenging. And I think, we really set out trying to write or come up with a model that was, the metaphor that comes to mind for me all the time when I'm talking about EMBARK is the blind man and the elephant. I think when we looked at the field, we saw that everybody had a really an excellent and important piece of the puzzle, but there was just a lack of cohesion between all the different ideas about how psychedelics heal out there. So we wanted something that brought them all together. And the challenge with that was not creating something that was so unwieldy and something really difficult for facilitators on a psychedelic trial to learn and work within. So we had to find something that was very streamlined and hewed really close to what people were bringing in terms of skills, and hewed really close to the requirements of evidence-based therapies and what we've learned from decades of psychotherapy research, while also doing justice to the full breadth of psychedelics.
You're talking about like the science and clinical trials and maybe not having all those protocols there. With psychedelic therapies, like, do you feel like you can really create a protocol? Because sometimes, things can go in such different directions. How do you conceptualize that?
We had to, it's definitely not a mousetrap model, right? It's like not a specific, in a lot of scientific discourse, even psychological discourse, there's the idea that there's a change mechanism that we're evaluating, and that like if you create a treatment which you try to standardize, and then there's like a specific change mechanism. For example, people have a mystical experience and then they get better, or people have like a meaningful making experience around their experience of death, for example, or they have a meaningful making around an unprocessed feeling state, like a catharsis of feeling that leads to a repair in a relationship that ends up being good for them. And they're like super overdetermined. And so we wanted to, with EMBARK, okay, we have 6 clinical domains, and in each of those domains, we have 20 different change mechanisms proposed. We don't know scientifically in valid ways whether each of these mechanisms may work, but what we've seen is that psychedelic healing is myriad, and so the ways that people get better will be myriad. And in the manual, then we basically have branching opportunities. So instead of saying, okay, you're going to see this particular thing happen, we say in your first integration session, the client, the patient, the participant may say, oh, I had like a really profound emotional, affective experience, the A domain in EMBARK, and I'm really motivated to make new changes in my life. That's for the K domain, keeping momentum, how to prevent relapse. I'm like ready for change, sort of like theory of change making. And so the rest of it kind of takes a sideline, and then you really just focus on those 2 domains and think about that, and respond in a patient-centered way. You want to like center everywhere the human experience here, rather than treating people like sprockets.
Right. Yeah. Anything you want to add?
No, I think that really says it. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I kind of like what you said. It's almost like this kind of like tent, right? And it's like there's a lot of things that can come up, and you have these domains in which you can then focus on. I just think about the complexity and how much stuff could come up in psychedelic experiences, and how do we really, do we systematize it, or do we keep it a little bit more organic and relational? And when I think about the K, the keeping momentum, I also think about sometimes we talk about that unfolding process, and how do we encourage people to stick with the process and be a little bit more organic? But I can imagine that's also tough when you're doing clinical trials or science, and maybe you need to think about different variables and controlling things and creating more protocols and systems.
Yeah, and I think something that we endeavored to do in this book was to not give really prescriptive advice on how to carry out every step of the process, but to really give clear guidelines that do allow for that kind of standardization and allow for people looking at the results of a trial that uses EMBARK to know what was going on and to replicate it. And another piece too that we brought in that we haven't really spoken to yet are the 4 ethical care cornerstones of EMBARK, which really make up a big part of what we call the spirit of EMBARK or the heart of EMBARK. And this is also, there are 4 general principles that are woven throughout all of the instructions and throughout the domains and how the interventions are framed in EMBARK. They include the trauma-informed care cornerstone. So really making sure that whatever interventions the facilitators are using are coming from a place of trauma-informed care. Another one is culturally competent care. Another one is ethically rigorous care, which attends to some of the specific ethical risks in psychedelic therapy. And the last one is collective care, which just keeps its eye on the broader context around the psychedelic work that's happening.
Yeah. What we find is in most psychotherapies, the idea that you act ethically is just sort of baked into your credo as a psychologist or a psychotherapist, but it's actually not part of the intervention. But because psychedelics are mind manifesting, right, and the mind is so broad that what could be manifested could be any number of things, and so we have to be. I think that a manual. You don't want to put the round peg into a square hole, right? But you need a manual. You need an approach which is open, in the same way that psychedelic approaches are non-specific amplifiers of human experience. The therapeutic processes may also be non-specific. They may be itemizable in some way, or they may boil down to specific domains, like we've done here. And, ethically, we wanted to put that right at the center. So EMBARK is like a 6+4 model, 6 clinical domains and 4 ethical cornerstones that we provide.
Yeah, super important. And especially just thinking about trauma informed, right? I think that's is a really big topic for, the psychedelic field. And for those that are getting training that don't have trauma, right? Because we're talking about, these non-specific amplifiers, what happens when that comes up. And I think that's so important to be educated in, be aware of.
Yeah, I was a trauma therapist on the MAPS trials for years, treating people specifically with capital T, criterion A, PTSD trauma, people who had seen combat and war or in car crashes. But the trauma of everyday life, the lowercase t traumatic events that most of us have been exposed to over the course of our childhoods and adolescence and adult lives, they arise. They arise in the work. And even if you're not explicitly providing a trauma treatment, you have to be prepared and informed. And honestly, there's been so much caution here, but I'm delighted by the ability for psychedelics to empower people, to give them some agentic control over even addressing and confronting these sorts of traumas. Because I think it, if it in an egolytic way, it sort of loosens our psychological architecture of defense, we can approach things that usually are scary, things we don't want to remember, the feelings we don't want to feel that we systematically avoid. And psychedelics seem to be able to invite people to approach that and metabolize it, resolve it. Maybe not permanently, but in a way that provides relief and affirmation and a feeling of meaning or closure or wholeness. And that's what trauma-informed, really good trauma-informed care is not about just minimizing harm, but actually maximizing the benefit of encounters with types of trauma as and when they may arise.
I don't know who said it. It was Peter Levine, Bessel van der Kolk. maybe it was some other sort of trauma-informed stuff I was reading. But, the body can't really tell the difference between a big T and a little t trauma, right? It's like our nervous system just knows that whatever is in there, it's affecting us. And yeah, how do we hold that? Even though, maybe somebody doesn't have a big T trauma, but their nervous system may be processing some of those compounded little T's over time, right?
Yeah, I mean, what I found, I mean, colloquially, I'm not an expert here, but my experience when working on some of the PTSD trials is that a lot of the people with the hardest experience, and I think there's some evidence for this with when they have as an adult a major traumatic event, the people who are more susceptible to having ongoing post-traumatic stress after that event are the ones who also have repeated, recurring experiences of trauma, lowercase traumas in their life, and and also a lot of people overlook those traumas. I have people that I work with in my private practice who never got in a car crash, never saw combat, thank goodness were never sexually abused. And they're like, I don't get why I'm so suffering so much. And I'm like, well, the sort of neglect and complex traumas of your life are actually so profound, so important. But they're like, but I don't have anything I can point to that quote, screwed me up. Why am I so screwed up? I need the hallmark event and the signal event, really. And it's hard work sometimes making the case that those little traumas, they do add up, and in fact, they're profound.
I think about, I have a big T trauma with my snowboarding accident when I was 16. And I do come back to that pretty often, but I think about more of the developmental and attachment type of stuff. It's a little bit more teased through, working through it in these states. So, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, just thinking about what you just said about your own trauma, it's such a big part of trauma-informed care is also attending to the relational dynamics that can come up around trauma. If, it's not just about the trauma coming up itself and getting worked on, but oftentimes people who are traumatized have, there's something that stands in the way of them being in the kind of relationships that they would find most fulfilling. So in psychedelic work, in the therapist-participant dynamic, we can see little micro movements or sometimes macro movements towards that kind of relationship, and being able to navigate that skillfully is so important. It's a huge part of trauma-informed care, not being able to, or not avoiding the possibility of creating additional harm, either by neglecting the fact that kind of movement is happening, or just responding to it in a way that adds insult to injury.
Yeah, great points. So I know you mentioned that this kind of came out of, the development of EMBARK came out of clinical trials. Is this going to be used specifically for clinical trials and within the science, or is this very practical for clinicians that are able to start to move into this space? Whether, let's use the example of Colorado, people are coming online, we'll be able to train facilitators. Could this be a model that is able to integrate that facilitators can start to learn about?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's in fact our hope, is that, we really learned a lot from our teachers. I feel profound gratitude for some of the people that I trained with and learned from over the last 20 years. And so we tried to, and we acknowledged that in the book, and we tried to bake a lot of that into the approach. And we would like to offer EMBARK as an approach that's broad and adaptable and extensible enough that it can be used for different indications. It can be used with different medicines, psychedelic medicines. And for people in Colorado or in other practices, with the book coming out, we hope that it's something that is taught and brought into course curriculum and brought into your trainings, or adapted for your own particular needs. We'd like to see it used in that way, as well as being used specifically in a clinical trial format. For example, Cybin's trials have used EMBARK with good clinical efficacy. In the last study, where we were treating people with major depressive disorder who had already actually been on an SSRI or SNRI for depression, we saw that 79% of people who received this treatment in the most efficacious arm with EMBARK, 79% had full remission from depression at 3 weeks. And in our 4-month follow-up, 75% of those people, 3/4 of them, were in full remission from depression. which is really promising, and it's one of the reasons why that approach is continuing in phase 3, and also we see it being used with like Dr. Tony Back's study at the University of Washington with his team to treat COVID-affected frontline healthcare workers, doctors and nurses who, frankly survived the moral injury of the COVID pandemic and everything that came and went with it, and have symptoms of depression and burnout from that.
Mm-hmm. And something else about EMBARK too that we haven't mentioned yet is that the EMBARK model itself is kind of like a meta model. The architecture is something like the 6 domains and the 4 care cornerstones. They can be adapted to work with any clinical indication and any psychedelic medicine to date so far. So you can take the EMBARK, like the overarching idea of EMBARK, and apply it to a whole range of different clinical trials and different clinical contexts.
Amazing. Alex, you brought up your teachers. I'd be curious to hear some of your influences in creating this and just in your life of like, who do you really pull from?
I want to acknowledge and honor Jeffrey Guss, psychoanalyst in New York, who was director of psychedelic therapy at NYU for many years. He was a friend. We met at a psychedelics conference in Oaxaca, Mexico, the home of Maria Sabina and the Mazatec people in 2005. And we just hit it off. I mean, psychedelic research was like in its infancy then, at least in the current era. But he directed the program at NYU for many years and has been, I think, a model therapist, a psychoanalyst, a mentor to me and to many other people. And I've, he's got some of the, he doesn't, he's not, it's not pablum with him. Like, he really cuts through a lot of the BS. And I think people respond and respect that. And I think there's like a little bit of the old heart feeling with it, where it's like he really wants people to be doing good work out there, and he's not interested in coddling people. So I appreciated how he showed up in my life and in the lives of the people that he teaches.
Amazing. How about you, Bill?
I'm thinking of a few different groups of people. The first one would probably be the EMBARK faculty who've trained on the EMBARK model. Jeff Guss is one of them. Adele LaFrance, Tony Back, Flory St. Amy, Marcella Odalora, Nicole Buchanan, Kylea Taylor. Am I forgetting anyone?
It's a stellar team.
Yeah, it
was really an incredible group of people. Nicole T. Buchanan, Alex
Kelman,
Dr. Alex Kelman,
I'd like to thank all of them. Their lectures are available on EMBARK Open Access, and they're just really, it's like a stellar foundational set of videos. And I'm also feeling called to really thank the participants who have been through psychedelic trials, who've been speaking about their experiences, both positive and beneficial, and also really difficult and negative. The more of them that speak up and the more forums we have to listen to them, the more we can learn about what's working and what's not working and what needs to change. I also want to thank a lot of the people who are engaged with ethical dimensions in this work. There's a whole list of them in the about the authors, the acknowledgement section of the book, because I do spend a lot of time engaging with the work of people who are not even clinical scientists, but maybe involved in the humanities or other aspects of psychedelic work, anthropology, just criticizing a lot of the things that we take for granted as clinicians and kind of showing us the bigger picture from outside. That's been really foundational for me, really fundamental.
Anything particular that we take for granted as clinicians? Curious to hear more about that.
I think that the biggest one for me is just the nature of what is healing. It's such a huge question that we're never really, at least in my graduate training, we never really get a chance to engage fully with that question. Like, how is our notion of healing? How does it relate to larger systems of power, larger systems of relatedness? Yeah, it's an interesting set of questions that I always kind of keep on my shoulder, like some people keep death on their shoulder.
Yeah. Keep healing on your shoulder.
Yeah.
Well, and it's interesting to think is like, does healing just exist within medical or clinical work? Right? Does it, exist beyond that too?
Yeah.
Oh, for sure not. Yeah. Absolutely not. Yeah.
So, Bill, we were chatting a little bit about, before we got recording, psychedelic therapies without, say, the therapy or support. And so thinking about a protocol like this, and maybe we're all a little bit biased, being trained clinically and thinking about these types of systems and protocols. How important do you think it is to have a system or a protocol when working with psychedelics, whether that's in a therapy setting, whether that's in a facilitation setting, or could we pull back from some of that and, let the substance, the medicine do its work?
I think that the notion that you would walk into a room and not bring with you an implicit protocol, an implicit approach, an implicit set of like thousands of hours of your life experience that lead you to be present and interact and intervene in specific ways, to not have that be a conscious thing is a little silly to me. And I was trained by Bill Richards in psilocybin therapy in 2008. He came up to New York and gave a training to Bill Richards is a lead therapist at Hopkins and a revered elder statesperson in the field. And in his early sort of training, he really does advocate, and I respectfully sort of disagree with him a little bit on this. I have profound respect for Bill, but this idea that, and he has a more complicated. So I don't want to create a straw man with Bill's argument, but there is this idea that you stand back and let the medicine do the work, and you sort of provide flight instructions. But in Bill and I, in our experiences and in talking with other people, the therapy presence, the presence of the person in the room or the two people in the room, it's such a huge part of set and setting that there's no way to like sand off all the edges of that and like just go in. I mean, you can go in and not be super directive. You can be non-directive or interdirective. You can go in and not, like a hammer say you have to be a nail. We're going to have particular change or growth in these particular ways, which we're going to measure and insist upon. But all those biases and priming and your interactions with the person are part of the experience, whether you would like that to be or not. And actually, I think that type of opportunities for relational repatterning, the heightened, what we think of as transferential and countertransferential field dynamics that always seem to play out in psychedelic experiences, good, bad, and otherwise, they will play out. And I think it's really important for any approach, whether it's EMBARK or one of the other leading sort of approaches, to take that deeply into consideration. And that's why quality training with integrity and people doing their own reflective practices about their privilege, about their blind spots, is essential, and why I think we need ongoing peer support and supervision from colleagues and clinical supervision from people who can help us out when we don't see our own blind spots. Yeah. What do you think? What are your thoughts about it?
The first thing that pops into my head was when I was working with folks with early episode psychosis, and it was a new program. And like the main ethos there was to be with people, just to be with. And there were times in the beginning, I was there like in the beginning, it was like, there before the house opened, we're getting the house all up and running. And there was times where it just felt so confusing. Like, what is to be with mean? And I know I went through this just this thing of like, we're following protocols, we're not, it feels very kind of like, what the hell is going on here? Right. And I was chatting with a teacher of mine, just kind of explaining it. And he said, yeah, it's really scary to be lost out to sea with no map. And, the map doesn't describe the territory, but at least you have something to anchor to. And when you don't have anything to anchor to, it can get really confusing and really kind of destabilizing in a sense. So I think having a map is important, right? It doesn't always dictate the territory. Maps change, landscapes kind of change, maybe roads change. I don't know if anybody's ever followed Google Maps and you end up on a road where you're like, where am I? Or that road doesn't exist anymore. But I think it is important to have something to anchor us, to feel like, how do I navigate this when maybe the waters get a little rough or confusing? At least I have something to kind of, root in.
Yeah. I mean, the only thing I'll say, just as an addendum to because what you're bringing up is that I think that the spirit, in the best sense of like stand back and let the medicine do the work, is for the clinician, the facilitator, to not be a hindrance to that person's process, and to really, and we really tried to center this, is to center the person's agency, the person who's taking this medicine, not their sense of control necessarily, but their sense of like agency to decide to take this medicine, to embark upon this journey, to do the work, to decide if they want to change their habits and their lives and how they relate to themselves and others. And they do that in concert with the psychedelic vectors of consciousness that open unto them with the practice. And if the psychedelic facilitator can stand back and let that process unfold and support it in a way that really centers that and honors that and takes the lead from the patient, from the participant, that's what we were hoping for.
Yeah. How about you, Pats?
No, I'm fully in agreement with what you two were saying. I think, the idea that any facilitator can go into the room and not do anything is a little erroneous. And, I find that the whole conversation about psychological support versus psychotherapy, like what is it? Are we actually doing something that rises to the level of psychotherapy? To me, it feels like a little bit of a distraction from the conversation that's trying to happen underneath that question, which is about who can do this work? Like what kind of credentials do they need? Do we have to pay them $200 an hour or $50 an hour? These are questions of affordability that are kind of masquerading as questions of clinical theory. So I think, unfortunately, there is this idea that's gaining traction that facilitators just come into the room and they're there making sure the person is safe, helping them to the bathroom if they need to. But I think, as Alex said, we know from our experience that so much more happens, whether it's in the relational field or some kind of spontaneous intervention that does come up if the person needs something. Most of the facilitators I know who I've spoken to who have worked on clinical trials, even where there's not a lot of psychotherapy supposed to be happening, still draw on their experience in caring for people and what they've learned about psychotherapy, and those kind of maps in the middle of the ocean that you're talking about. So I wish we could just have the conversation around, instead of what is it, psychotherapy, psychological support, more a question of what kind of training do people need? What kind of skills do they need?
Yeah, what do you think about that? What type of training and skills do folks need? Because it is interesting that, I feel like a lot, like in those early days, it was really focused on a lot of the science and the psychotherapy. We're seeing MDMA go through the medical kind of system, FDA approval, same with psilocybin, what Cybin's been working on, versus now we're starting to see maybe other models like Oregon, Colorado. Sounds like Colorado will have 2 tracks with a licensed, non-licensed track, but we'll use Oregon, for example, where you don't need a clinical license. And I know there was a little bit of opposition thrown by the APA and some of the boards over there saying, like, why weren't we involved in some of this decision making? Some people wish it kind of stayed within the realm of medicalization. What does it take to be a facilitator? Should it be within the realms of psychotherapy, or should it be more accessible to other people?
It's a really good question, and this is going to sound like punting a little bit, but I think it's an empirical question. I think it still remains to be seen whether someone who doesn't have a master's or a Ph.D. or an M.D. can be a facilitator and find efficacious outcomes. And I think we're a little hindered, at least in the U.S., under the FDA guidelines. Someone has to be a licensed mental health provider in the room. So we're always going to have someone in there who probably is drawing from their training and from their psychotherapy or other skills. So it's a little hard. I don't know if we're going to get good data on that question for a while.
There's this old question in psychology research, which is what works for whom? And so the question of like what works. I was part of a startup company a few years ago called Happy, which is not psychedelically related, but the idea is how do we leverage peer support? Like, how do we, when people are in crisis, when they're distressed, they're upset, they're anxious, they're stressed out, they can call in to this app, this line, and talk with, somebody who's received training who it does not have a licensed healthcare medical provider sort of license, but they're the kind of people that say to us, I've been helping people my whole life. I talk to people all the time. I love talking with people. I'll be the other warm human voice on the other end of the line to talk through some of the stressors that this person is going through. I think in the what works for whom question, it may be, and I see this happening all the time on forums in the psychedelic community. A lot of people are like, I don't ever need to work with anybody. You should trip alone. Or it's totally appropriate for you to trip with your friends. Or, it's fine for you to work with a licensed facilitator, but they don't have to have other levels of credential. They don't have to be a licensed psychotherapist or psychologist. My experience is that works for different people. Some people are really, most of the time, even the vast majority, totally fine to maybe take psychedelics alone or at home. We might see that in the future. Some people may need some level of support, like a sober sitter model or a monitor model, to use that sort of framing. I got to say, though, that some people, and determining, triaging who this is at the gate, right, at the intake, it's like, well, who's going to need that person who's there who actually has a few thousand hours of clinical experience, because they're going to have, it's hard to predict who's going to have a full-blown panic attack in the middle of the psychedelic experience, or have an extreme moment of paranoia, or encounter a very, very difficult memory that requires a higher level of support, that they may have experiences of suicidal ideation or other potential risk for a serious adverse event. And in those circumstances, I'd like to see the person with the higher standard of who's seen this before, who's worked with people who've gone through something like this before under good supervision, and it's not their first rodeo. And that's a little dismissive. It's not the first time they're seeing something like this, and so the problem is triaging is really hard. Right now.
Yeah.
I do feel like there might be, in addition to the empirical question and the question of like, what's efficacious and for whom, there might be a bit of I'm feeling into this. I don't know if I fully endorse this, but I wonder if there's an ethical imperative to give anyone who's seeking help for a diagnosed psychiatric condition, anyone who's being referred by a medical provider, psychiatrist, to give that person someone who has some kind of mental health background. Just because, like you're saying, Alex, there's the possibility for linkages to other forms of care, additional forms of support, and maybe even suggestions of alternative forms of treatment if at some point in the, let's say, 3 dosing session protocol, there's some indication that maybe some other kind of psychotherapy or psychiatric intervention would be helpful, having someone who can really hold that knowledge for the person.
Yeah. And I love that you brought up like peer support, because the place that I was working at, it was peer support oriented. And that was based off of the work of Dr. Lauren Mosher back in the 70s. And, I saw some magic happen there. And, I think I'm going off of some of the draft rules in Colorado. I may have this mistaken. So, please do some of your own research. But as you're saying, like, the non-clinical track, I think they can only take people that aren't presenting with any sort of mental health disorder or advertise that it's like mental health like treatment, versus if somebody is a little bit more, they're trying to heal their depression or whatnot, then they have to go to somebody that's clinically licensed.
Yeah.
And I mean, obviously that just falls within the scope of psychotherapist, right? But yeah, I don't know. I love to see like a diverse ecosystem. Sometimes I think about like archetypes and like personality traits. And just as you were saying, Alex, like, there's somebody that's doing peer support on the phone that just loves talking to people. And it's like sometimes people just have that type of personality, that like warm, caring, empathetic type of personality. And yeah, maybe they weren't able to go through school.
And look, when that person who was always, people call them for support all the time, and is warm and empathic and a talker and a listener, they probably are already doing the things that we naturally teach people in psychotherapy. They're asking open-ended questions instead of closed-ended questions. They're giving emotional reflective feedback, saying, sort of summarizing and adding a little bit without diverging from what the person's saying. I used to teach introduction to psychotherapy basically at NYU's graduate program. And it's a tiny little class, like 6 people. And you get all these excited master's students who are like in their first semester of their graduate training in New York, and they're going to learn to be therapists. And I was like, okay, great. You get in a room. You're the therapist for 5 minutes and you're the client. And we're going to record it, and then we're going to look at it together, and then you switch. You're the therapist, and go do it. No training. And you'd be surprised. These people who are naturally, they seize up, they ask questions that like upon, like, why do you think you asked that question in that moment? And you were looking back at the video in front of the whole class, and they're like, honestly, I was preoccupied with my own theory about what was going on. And like, I really would have done something differently here. And so when you do that process over and over and over again, it's a really rich training process. And I think it counts for something. That being said, there are a lot of licensed doctors and psychologists and psychotherapists out there who somehow made it through all the training and are not people I would refer to either. So it's not 100%, correlation between, people I'd really trust to work with people and that level of training.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And that's why I think sometimes I come back to like those archetypes, right? It's like sometimes people just have it. And there's people that just were able to just go through the school and get the license and get out there and and provide that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Alex, and we were chatting a little bit earlier. I'm just being conscious of time too, because we need to probably wrap up here soon. We were just talking about earlier how things have really evolved over the past decade or so. And so I'd be curious to hear both of your insights of like what you've kind of been through in the past decade or longer with psychedelics, and maybe where would you like to see things kind of evolve and go to? And like maybe also what is the field missing right now, if anything? This is a big question, so we can take our time thinking.
It's like, you have a thought to start, Bill, or?
That's a really huge question. Sometimes I give a presentation and I open with a slide that has like 20 or 30 things that the field is missing right now. So, I'm trying to think of one that comes to mind now. Maybe I really think we need to come to terms with this question of the relevance and importance of experiential training with psychedelics. There's still such a debate going on around that. And I think both sides make a really compelling argument. And yeah, that to me, I think that question needs a lot more attention.
Anything particular with that question, like that you think about, or which side are you on?
I guess I find it so compelling because I find myself on different sides of it on different days.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I agree with that. And I'll just say, psychedelic medicines have been part of human history for a long time. And so we're just, this last blip of 10 years or 20 years is so short. But it does feel like every handful of years, it's like a completely different topography. Just like the direction of the wind has changed again, and there's a whole different thing going on. There was a sort of sweetness when I was a graduate student and like going to psychedelic conferences in 2001 and 2004 and 2005 and 2006. And we started the team at NYU in 2006. The sweetness was that like there was no published research and there was no money and no industry and no funding and no status or acclaim. There was only people who didn't want this to happen is what it felt like. And so if you were doing it, we were all compadres. We're like, kind of on the same team. Like Hefter and MAPS didn't always see eye to eye, but like there was this idea that like we're all kind of like in the same astral psychedelic vehicle trying to do some important work. There's a sense of mission and collective work, and the community I think has grown big enough that that's not really possible anymore. In fact, people want really different things and see really different things. What I would like to see is, I think it's hard to try to fit psychedelic practice, whatever it may become, and whether it's medicalization, psychotherapy, peer support, or even decriminalization, public policy shifts, people doing underground work, sort of sort of psychedelic churches and other forms of ritual process. I think it's going to be hard to fit that into existing models. And so the idea, it's like, well, how do we code this? Where does this go in the existing framework? Like, which existing hole in the block in the wall do we shove this into? Is always going to leave us feeling a little frustrated because I don't think that, and this is not pie in the sky stuff. I think we need to get creative and innovative, but I don't think that psychedelic therapy is going to work just like regular therapy. Nor do I think psychedelic therapy is going to work like existing medication prescription for other psychiatric indications. Like it's its own thing. So it's going to be some growing pains. Yeah.
Yeah. And to that point too, your point about fitting it into the existing models of care, something that I think would be really helpful would be just acknowledging, as it seems like the field is gradually doing right now, acknowledging the previously largely unacknowledged potential for really adverse outcomes and people to exit treatment feeling sometimes worse off than when they started. Maybe new symptoms have arisen, and having some kind of appropriate level of care and ongoing support for people who are experiencing something like that. Because right now, psychiatric hospitalization is not appropriate. Sending them home and hoping for the best is not appropriate. So we don't really have something that we can offer people who are going through that right now.
That's huge. Yeah, I think about that quite often about like some of the fallout that's going to happen with folks, whether it's in the underground or just as this becomes more accessible. And I'm sure it's happening. I'm just thinking about some of my own experiences in those early years. And something I keep thinking about, and I say this within our vital training program, it feels like, a lot of places are trying to like just build up psychedelic therapy. I'm kind of more interested in what does the safety net, the cultural safety net look like, and how can we train people to be that safety net in a sense to catch some folks that might have a really challenging integration experience, right? Or they have this experience that I think we've used this term before on the podcast, creates ontological shock, right? It's like just shocks our belief system. It's like we have to come back here and go, what the hell is all this? And just finding some of those supports to then have to navigate those waters. I know for me in those early years, it was really challenging, just feeling so alone and be like, where the hell do I go? And thankfully, I was able to go to a school that contained me to explore it in an experiential way, but a theoretical way as well. So yeah, I think about that. It's like, what's the safety net? What are those systems where we're able to help people to work through it a little bit more? And it'd be interesting to see like houses and stuff like, the Soteria model, peer support, people could get respite for like a few weeks or, maybe a month or something for their integration. I don't know how that's going to, function financially, but it'd be interesting to kind of see stuff like that emerge.
I mean, I recently was meeting with some Shipipo and Ayos who are in the Amazon, and they have a similar model where people come for like 4 to 8 weeks and sort of are in a supported model where their food is brought to them, they're drinking medicine and herbal non-psychedelic plants and receiving care for a longer period of time to deal with ontological shock or deeper problems, both medically and psychologically, that they may be dealing with. And there's a lot for us to learn from models of healing that predate, the founding of the APA.
All right. Well, I'm being mindful of time. I want you to get on your call and have a little break. So thank you both for this time. This has been really enjoyable just to be able to podcast in person and sit down with you. Unfortunately, I think our camera died, so didn't capture all of it. But anything that you guys want to close with? If people are interested in learning about EMBARK, learning about the book, where can they purchase it? Where can they, take the training again? And just any closing thoughts that you guys might have. And Bill, we'll start with you.
Yeah, the book is available on Oxford University Press. You can go to the publisher's website, order it directly. It's also available for roughly the same price on other book reseller websites. If you want to find out more about EMBARK before diving into the book, you can check out a paper that Alex and I co-authored in Frontiers in Psychology back in 2022. The title is something like Models of Psychedelic-Assisted Psychotherapy. Introducing EMBARK is also in the title. So if you Google all that, it'll come up. And it's an open access paper. You can also check out for free the EMBARK Open Access Training Program that we've mentioned a couple of times. You can watch videos by EMBARK faculty. And
that's embarkapproach.com.
Yeah. Anything else, Alex?
Honestly, I'm just excited to hear from people. We've heard really lovely things from clinicians that says this makes sense to me. Like it actually is useful. Like I don't feel like I have to translate a lot when I'm sitting in the chair talking with somebody. Kind of like makes sense intuitively to me, but it provides a framework. So if you're interested in using it for your clinical trial or in your clinic or in your private practice, and you end up adapting it or learning from it, or you have criticisms and ways to improve it, like we'd love to hear. We'd like for the community to really engage with it, and vice versa. We'd like to engage with the community.
Amazing.
And I'd like to express gratitude for anyone who engages with EMBARK in any way. We meant it to be a model of best practices as the field currently stands, and we really feel that it represents that. And it's also, the field is still very new. It's still evolving. It's still growing. So we think that there might be new outgrowths of EMBARK, new iterations of EMBARK, big updates to EMBARK, and models that move past EMBARK. So we offer EMBARK in the spirit of continuing to grow this field together in a wise way.
Just about to embark on the journey. All right.
Thanks so much for having us on the podcast. We really appreciate
it. Of course.
You and all the work that you guys are doing.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
And there you have it, everybody. Dr. Alex Belser and Dr. Bill Brennan. I hope you liked that one and learned a bunch about the EMBARK method. And I can't wait to learn a bunch more about it and maybe get trained in it someday too. So Yeah, again, we have a retreat coming up in Pennsylvania in I think a month or so. You can learn more about that at psychedelicstoday.com. That's done with our breathwork partners. And we will also be launching Vital in September, and applications are open if you want to join our answer to the need to train gazillions of people in psychedelia. Come check out Vital. We've got a pretty robust page. We can answer a lot of questions. You can schedule an interview if you'd like, but applications are open, and we would love to have you. And I think that's it. So thanks for tuning in. And this is Joe Moore signing off for Psychedelics Today. See you on the next episode. Bye-bye.